So the good news is that people care, right? These companies care about at least giving the image of the fact that they're responsible stewards of new powerful technologies.
Welcome to the Threat Intelligence Podcast, Episode 2.
The bad news is that this head start that we've been given, right, has to be taken very seriously.
This podcast features Brian Nakayama and Rachel James and their work with OWASP GenAI, as they are the volunteer leads in the AI Threat Intelligence Initiative. The opinions expressed in this podcast are theirs and theirs alone, and do not reflect the opinions of the organizations through which they are employed. My name is Dave Hatt, and I'm the host facilitator of the podcast. And Rachel, let's start with you. Can you give us an overview of this model that Anthropic has developed and what makes it different from any other model release?
The Mythos model has been, touted by Anthropic and its red team as having some pretty advanced and novel cybersecurity implications, particularly as it applies to being able to reason over code and identify vulnerabilities and exploitations, right? And it was really interesting because this actually was really related to some research that Brian and I had been conducting as it applies to AI's capability to discover and successfully generate exploitations. So in our phase one of our research, which was now almost about 2 years ago, we were working with early models of Claude and ChatGPT and Obama, and we wrote in our initial findings in phase one some of our observations of what we thought were pretty serious limitations in the way, what was limiting in the way AI was reasoning over these problems that we anticipated would actually, as models continued to get better with their context window size, chain of reasoning was another really, really big one that we had. So we had some predictions about the way models needed to progress, about the way model reasoning needed to change in order for the AIs to be sort of reasonably to be weaponized by threat actors to be effective in this type of space. Threat actor activity at the time was largely leveraging AI for crafting phishing emails, to do reconnaissance, and to do big data analysis, not necessarily to actually produce malicious code or to analyze a vulnerability and produce an exploitation, a working exploitation. AI at the time, 2 years ago, when it was successful at doing those kinds of things, it was largely operating in a fuzzing capacity. So it was just like a spray and pray. Like it was throwing everything against the wall, and if something happened to work, it happened to successfully spit out an SQL injection that you were vulnerable to, then it would work. But the actual process of reasoning that needed to happen, that an offensive actor, a threat actor, somebody who's a pen tester would do, was still lacking. So a good example of this that I always point to is Kerber roasting, right? If I went to ChatGPT, went to Claude 2 years ago, and I said, hey, make me a Kerber roasting script. First of all, most of the time I would encounter a guardrail, right? It would say, oh, no, I'm sorry. I can't do that. That might be potentially harmful. If I was using a do anything model or a local model, it would also sort of similarly say, like, what do you mean by Kerber roasting? And sort of like not really understand what the ask was. But if I said to ChatGPT or really any model, give me a PowerShell script that would enumerate all the service principal names in Active Directory. Popped it right out. Okay, now give me another script that I can use so I can identify deprecated encryption algorithms that are being used. Whoop, right? So if I handheld this AI step by step through it, I could get a little bit of uplift. So we started referring to this shorthand in our research group as like an 80-20 rule, which is to say 80%, if you had 80% knowledge of what you were doing and what you were needing, you could get about a 20% uplift from using the tools. This was like 2 years ago. Then Opus 4.6 came out, and there was a red team report that came from Anthropic, and it was talking about the way that AI was now reasoning over vulnerabilities. Now, again, this is a little bit different than a research we conducted, because in these cases, both with Opus 4.6 and with Mythos, the advances that they're talking about are when the model has access to the code. However, what we know about the changes in the way the reasoning is happening in the context window size and other things, based off of our phase 1 findings, we believe that that's extensible to these black box scenarios where they're just encountering machines on a network and attempting to find a vulnerability to exploit. And one of those things was, instead of doing this like fuzzing spray and pray type activity, was in code, it was actually looking at what is the function that the code is actually doing, what is its purpose, looking in its own memory and understanding and training for similar types of functions and where there could be vulnerabilities that are in them, and then constructing actually working exploits. And so, probably one of the most, there's always like a lot of hype in these spaces, and especially with Mythos not being open to the public right now, the people who have access to it are under something called Project Glasswing, which is a subset of people who've been given sort of early access. We think to sort of give them a head start in cleaning up their own house. So there's a lot that's being sort of theoretically assumed about the way these are working. But we believe that there's like a different transformer technology that's probably been adapted. It has a better chain of thought reasoning capability, which was one of our initial findings. It does more, it's capable of more breadth level of reasoning rather than sort of getting stuck and siloed in a very specific sort of chain of thought. It has a better ability to have a breadth of contextual concepts. This is one of those places where Brian and I both have to really look at some of the really intense and sometimes quite extreme claims that are being made about its capabilities, but also look at, again, ground truth. One of the things that was a huge indicator to us that this was fundamentally different was not only the behavior that we had seen in Opus 4.6, which was just before it, but also OpenBSD, which is an open source operating system that's been around for, I think, close to 30 years at this point. And because it's open source, that code has been open. Like, everybody can see that code, and they've had bug bounties and all those kinds of stuff. It found 27 vulnerabilities in OpenBSD, previously undiscovered, right? And some of these were critical. Some of them were very devastating level exploitation. And so we look at that, we look at the way that the model reasoning has happened. And I want to be clear about something, is that as far as we can tell, this appears to be a natural progression, right? This appears to be related to our phase 1 findings, which is we could see a natural progression in the way these models would reason, the way their context windows would be handled, the way the transformation technology, right? The models we originally worked with were feed forward. Now we have an MOE type model. We have recurrent depth transformer technology, which really changes like the actual neural network attention layer space and how that operates. That's a natural progression. So we actually believe some of the advancements that we're seeing in terms of cybersecurity capabilities in this aren't like just Anthropic's Mythos's special sauce, that this is probably going to be extensible to many models moving forward, which is actually in many ways a much more important threat signal than just one model owned by one frontier model provider who's keeping it behind like Project Glasswing and the hype that is around that, but rather this progression in offensive capabilities is extensible among a lot of models. How that in our observation is affecting the threat landscape, I think we've seen some pretty interesting things. Brian, do you want to talk a little bit about what does this mean when we have a model that has more advanced capabilities? Especially, I mean, we don't quite know yet. We theorize a lot of how those advanced capabilities could work in a black box scenario, but there's a lot of folks that are using open source code, even at an enterprise level. What's it going to mean for those folks?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good question in terms of, trying to, let's say, have a sober analysis of the capability advancement, right? So one thing I will say that is a little bit of interesting research that, everyone took the Mythos release as an opportunity to sell you something, right? It comes from Isle, which is an LLM powered vulnerability, I think provider. And so their claim is that they were able to use multiple open source models to find basically the same set of vulnerabilities as Mythos, right? And so part of what that suggests is a little bit about thinking about operational deployment context. How's your harness looking in terms of best being able to then use an LLM to reason over code? Which isn't to kind of, let's say, deflate Mythos. I think the thing is that you're taking a company that's an expert at finding vulnerabilities. And at least in terms of Anthropic's case, they're saying that this is fairly simplistic setup, I think, comparatively, in terms of being able to identify and then weaponize those exploits. But there is like something interesting there, right? So the major advancement, it appears, from Mythos is that ability to find vulnerabilities in white box testing, basically where it has access to source code, right? In terms of black box testing, there just isn't enough comparative data to provide, let's say, meaningful assessment, right? So what does that mean, right? If, for example, Project Glasswing, which is an attempt to give vendors a preview to help them clean up their source code, if, let's say, it remains in limited release, then theoretically we could see a decline in vulnerabilities as they are able to proactively find and patch flaws in their software. Of course, that depends on the vendor's desire to actually spend the time and effort to patch vulnerabilities in their software, right? Which given there's a great website, 0 Day Clock, which if you look at it, the kind of quantity of vulnerabilities in software is increasing at basically an exponential rate at this point. Is not entirely clear, right? So that depends on the ultimate impact, depends on both the willingness of people who are using this to find vulnerabilities to actually patch them. But then, let's say, as the capability proliferates, as models become better at this, as, let's say, for example, harnesses become kind of more widespread that are able to do that sort of bringing down the barrier to entry, then that will just basically create massive supply chain issues where so many companies will use an open source package, which we can very easily find vulnerabilities in using Mythos or a model with an equivalent capability, whether that's through kind of size or harness, right? And it'll cause escalating series of vulnerabilities being found and exploited. I think there are other kind of capabilities which we don't have a very good sense of yet, right? In terms of its ability to do attack orchestration, right? To basically organize an attack against an organization. The AI Security Institute out of the United Kingdom did do a test on a range, which is attempts to model a corporate network. They did find in 3 times out of 10, it was able to, kind of get to the goal, capture the flag in terms of that test range. No other model had been able to do so before. But I think the worthwhile caveat, as they're saying, is like, this model is a weakly defended corporate network. And let me tell you, plenty of weakly defended corporate networks out there that are being compromised already by individuals, right? And so, to say that this provides a new threat in that sense, it's not clear yet, right? Whether, for example, that attack orchestration capability could potentially proliferate, and is it worth it to have a success rate that's 30% of the time, right? Particularly against an organization that might have active defenses, defenders, that sort of thing. Other questions are, what is the actual exploit yield rate? So, for example, I know in the FreeBSD example, Anthropic says that they had to do 1,000 runs costing $20,000 in order to find those vulnerabilities, right? And, for example, like Isle, which was able to reproduce those using small open source models, they never said how many runs they had to do. And I think this goes precisely to our point where, we don't care about laboratory conditions. We care about how do these things actually operate when someone's trying to make a buck off of them, right? Are they willing to sink tens of thousands of dollars into a model run in order to find a vulnerability when they could potentially pay someone else to do it, or just use another method for entry, right, or access? And so that's just some of those unknown questions. I think, a key kind of capability that may make a difference is exploit operationalization, finding a good exploit, turning it into working code, right? Some of the tests that Anthropic did are kind of like a little like, they're set up for success, right? Running the, Firefox's JavaScript engine without the kind of defense and death protections, that sort of thing. But, I think going back to that, it took 1,000 runs, to find those free VSD loans, how many runs does it take to produce that working exploit code, right? And are actors willing to bear that cost in order to do it when you have alternatives possible? And then so, maybe to the final point, proliferation, probably there is going to be a trend where other models are going to have similar levels of ability to identify vulnerabilities. As many people have said, there's an endless amount of flawed code that you can train on. There's a limited universe of exploits, which is why the other exploits are a little bit more valuable and kind of important in terms of that advancement, right? So on the one hand, you can see models by other providers kind of level up to that level, or you develop a better harness that's able to, kind of run a low power model. But then the other thing is, the potential for distillation attacks, which is something both Anthropic and Google have been talking about, where, another model provider, where a foreign state is basically able to try and copy model capabilities. Right. So if Mythos, let's say, becomes more widely available, Anthropic appears to be staying a little bit mum about whether that's going to happen. You could see the rise of distillation attacks where a foreign adversary or a, kind of another model provider might be basically trying to extract the internal logics, right, for very cheap and then put them into another model and then kind of sell access to that, right, at a much lower cost. So, the kind of key landscape questions are going to fall back to that question of proliferation and expansion of this capability. And then moreover, once we have better testing, what are the actual yield rates for vulnerabilities and exploits? Because again, foreign adversaries, let's say state-backed actors, may not necessarily have the same, they got a ton of funding, they're going to be able to sink whatever they want into this. But, the average e-criminal probably isn't going to be able to afford 1,000 runs against Mythos, right? We need kind of better data to be able to kind of give a firm impact. But I think those are the key questions for me. Again, proliferation.
And I think that was, that was part of our observations that was backed up by, I want to say the NCSC in the UK, was that there is probably capability uplift that's happening for threat actors with AI, but it's not evenly distributed, right? Like you said, the tier of threat actor that can afford to spend $20,000 in token usage in order to discover a vulnerability, their capability, their resources are so high. Do they really need AI at that point to do it, right? They've already been successful. And we've seen record profits from a lot of these ransomware groups in the past couple of years that were not AI fueled. To your point about vulnerabilities, the vulnerability, like the folks in charge of the CVE have basically said, like, we're so overwhelmed, we're not even going to try to catch up anymore. Like, we've been trying to get a backlog, and we're just sort of giving up, which I think has huge implications for this space as well. Yeah, to your point, I wanted to ask you if you had seen the Bloomberg reporting, because when you talk about like the threat vectors as it comes to this, the Bloomberg reporting was talking about, essentially when Anthropic is giving people access to Project Glasswing, they're like giving it to the company, and the company is then managing which employees get access. And it sounds like there was like a third-party contractor who essentially like gave up his access to some Discord group. So like now a bunch of sort of random people got a hold of Mythos, and it sounds like they largely like goofed around and like created some web applications for it. But now do we have to worry as a sort of threat vector, as an attack vector, that if companies are being responsible and maybe they do have a unique capability, it is uniquely dangerous, and they give people sort of early access, that's now going to leak out? Like, because now we as defenders, we don't have access to Mythos, but potentially it might be leaking out to motivated threat actors. What do you think about that in terms of like the threat landscape?
Yeah, no, I think that's a key problem. And I think, one of I feel like I regularly see reporting that, there are massive underground markets selling API keys to foundation model providers, right? And so, in terms of that impact, right, thinking about, you got to lock down your API keys for AI model access at your company just because that's going to be a huge target. And it's like a lot of the times it's like basically creating like chatbot girlfriends, as I've seen the kind of common criminal use case. But I think maybe ideally, malicious uses of this for generating code, finding vulnerabilities, exploits will probably be big enough that you'll probably notice that someone has stolen your API key and just racked up a $20,000 bill from Anthropic. But I think, again, that kind of, let's say, desire to access these models is really going to place a premium on basically stealing those sorts of like credentials to get access to these models, right? And again, there's a thriving underground markets for this. And it seems like this is a trend that will only be accentuated, right, with the release of these big time models.
Yeah, when I saw the Bloomberg reporting, I was like, oh, great. That means if you do happen to beg, borrow, and plead with somebody to get early access, now you've just painted a giant target on your back, on your company's back, because now you are a vector for them to get access to this advanced form of AI that, all reporting and every hype cycle everywhere is saying like this has unique attack and cybersecurity implications. Great. Now if my company is sort of publicly somehow involved with Project Glasswing as a cybersecurity person, now I've got that to worry about, right?
So I was gonna ask a couple of questions, and they're interesting. So the question I was gonna ask, and I'm just give me a little bit of leeway here. Is there any good news in these recent developments, and how does it play out for companies and organizations looking to stay on top of these threats and give actionable items? Now, I will follow those comments up by saying what struck me with what you both said in terms of, is there any good news in this recent developments? It would appear as though it's at this particular moment potentially cost prohibitive for threat actors to go after large organizations because they're having to actually pay for the tokens to be able to create these codes that would go in and have the AI on their behalf perform malicious activities. So it feels kind of like, and I believe we touched on this in the first episode, it's something like the medium is the message, or akin to the medium is the message, where there's so much hype around the damage that AI can potentially cause. But what you're saying is, yeah, that might be, but it's complex, it's expensive, and it's difficult. So then if I'm a CFO of a company or a CEO of a company, and I don't have the technical knowledge that you have to even understand the acronyms that you're discussing, and I'm starting to freak out because I'm hearing that, holy cow, everybody has access to this AI and this open source code, and they're going to hack my startup, and they're going to destroy me before I even get going. Maybe if we were to diffuse some of that panic and then give some actionable items to those people in those positions where they do want to secure their organization. So maybe some of the things that we could do to tie it back to OWASP GenAI project, this podcast, and gives maybe a little bit of balance, if not peace of mind.
I'll give the good news, you give the bad news, right? How about
okay, all right, that sounds good.
So I'll say that I think the good news is that Project Glasswing exists, right? That Anthropic recognized an emergent capability in a model. And as much as we like to kind of like cynically say, well, marketing, you're having an IPO, I think it's worthwhile that they have a consideration that they have to be responsible with their model, right? I think model providers have not always necessarily been responsible. And, I think it's, worth giving them credit for that. The Firefox put out a blog that I think it's called something like The End of 0 Days, talking about how in their most recent build, they're able to find over 100 vulnerabilities using Mythos, and that, this helps basically gives a major advantage to software developers in order to start buttoning those down, right? Of course, that depends on the willingness and desire of software developers to, close those up and button them down. But I think it, suggests, kind of a broader sense of, that these companies have a responsibility not to unleash potentially damaging capabilities on the world, right? So, for example, there are other vulnerability detection programs like, OpenAI has Aardvark, and they also provide, a similar level of controlled access. I believe it's called through their trusted access program to cybersecurity models. Google has Big Sleep, right? And so there's a real sense that we can be turning this technology in order to making software more secure, right? As opposed to just finding new ways to make the threat actors able to write malicious code, socially engineer things like that. So the good news is that people care, right? These companies care about at least giving the image of the fact that they're responsible stewards of new powerful technologies, and that, given the number of partners in the Glasswing program, that companies, at least initially, seem to be very willing to use these technologies to those ends, right? Finding vulnerabilities, resolving them, basically helping to reduce the attack surface using this access. Okay, bad news.
Well, I will say, the bad news is that this head start that we've been given, right, has to be taken very seriously. If you are somebody who's a decision maker, you're in an information security risk management role, you really need to start thinking about the fact that the time to vulnerability disclosure and the time to exploitation, we have seen a trajectory of that time closing and closing and closing. And many of us are still operating off of like patch timelines that were established like 4 years ago before any of this was like a reality in our threat landscape, right? And we're kind of treating all vulnerabilities based off of their criticality in like a set schedule. And we have to really step up our game as it comes to that. We have to also be willing, as Brian said, to use these tools. And yes, Brian and I talk a lot about how the uplift of AI in these spaces is not even among threat actors, right? So like we still are not quite yet at the point where a script kiddie can like, who doesn't have any sort of background, can use AI to infiltrate the Pentagon. We're not quite there in terms of capability uplift. But when it comes to exploitation, we talk about like $20,000. Not the, semi good news is that not the entire world of threat actor activity is going to be able to afford to sink in $20,000 on the hope that they can find a 0-day and they can find an exploit. The bad news is that 0-day exploits on the market have been worth tens of thousands of dollars, in some cases, millions of dollars for a very long time. So those higher capability threat actors that do exist that are nation state backed or otherwise very financially well resourced, it's absolutely likely that if they're looking at an output of $20,000 with a potential profit return of 4x, 5x that amount, it's very likely that they're going to leverage it in that way. And further, just like we've seen, Brian talked a lot about the harness, right? The harness that's involved in some of this work. We have seen before with like phishing kits and other types of similar developed attack techniques that very well resourced, very technical threat actor groups will create these tools that they then resell to threat actors who are at a lower level of sophistication. And we've been looking at this commoditization. There was fraud GPT and worm GPT that came out. The legitimate ones kind of only actually existed for a couple of months before the guy was doxxed and a lot of it was taken down. But then there was a flood of fraud, a flood of people who were trying to fill that space and say, yeah, mine's fraud GPT 2.0. And we could see that there was a lot of transactions. So we know that there's demand in this space by lower sophistication actors who want to be sold a malicious designed or maliciously specific AI system for the purpose of these attacks. And, market demand in a dark web space works very much like market demand in our regular lives. If people are willing to pay for it, it will get built. And so we do have, I feel like Glasswing and some of these other frontier model providers doing these type of like private test runs with these companies is giving the rest of us a little bit of a heads up, but it is a little. It is not much of a time for us to really think about, are we in a position where we're ready for the time of vulnerability disclosure or the time that code is released to a working exploit being available to people, that time being compressed so rapidly? Do you have enough people who are going to be able to rapidly respond to an emergency patch now scenario that might be 30% of your infrastructure? You really need to think about the resourcing. You need to think about your vulnerability management, your bug bounties, the disclosure system, your remediation timelines when you have your internal security testing people using these tools, right? And they discover a vulnerability in the code and they're disclosing it to your developers. Have you staffed enough that you can accelerate those timelines and you can say remediation time now needs to be compressed because the exploitation time is being compressed? These are all really important questions. There was actually the Cloud Security Alliance in combination with OWASP and a whole bunch of other groups put out this guide about making a Mythos Ready security program, where it talks a lot about these things. And there's a huge emphasis on really rethinking the way you are trying to discover vulnerabilities inside of your own organization and these vulnerability remediation timelines. So definitely check it out. And you'll also see other things that are coming from like our agentic systems in that nature.
Thanks for listening. Like, follow, and subscribe wherever you get your favorite podcasts. Thanks to Rachel, James, and Brian Nakayama for this great information. Catch them on the next episode of the Threat Intelligence Podcast. Scott Clinton is executive producer for OWASP GenAI, and my name is Dave Hatt. I'm executive producer for Rum Runner Media.